You're getting senile, Mom. We can't trust you with money anymore. My son Jason's words hit me like ice water as I stood frozen in my own kitchen doorway, watching him rifle through my financial documents spread across the dining room table. Look at these bank statements. You're confused, making mistakes. It's time we took control before you lose everything we've worked so hard to build. I hadn't made a sound entering the house, my soft-soled shoes silent on the hardwood floors, and now I understood why. This wasn't concern for my well-being. This was an ambush, carefully orchestrated while I was supposedly at my doctor's appointment. Jason sat at the head of my dining table like he owned it, his wife Sandra perched beside him with that smug expression I'd grown to despise, and my own financial advisor, David Morrison, shuffling through papers with an uncomfortable expression that told me everything I needed to know about whose side he'd chosen. The conversation I'd walked in on revealed months of planning. Jason had been building a case for guardianship, painting me as a confused elderly woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. Sandra had been documenting every small oversight, the time I'd forgotten to pay a credit card bill, the day I'd seemed disoriented at the grocery store checkout, the moment I'd asked the same question twice during a family dinner. They'd been collecting evidence like prosecutors preparing for trial, and I was the defendant who didn't even know she was on trial. But what struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how completely they'd underestimated me. Jason kept referring to the money we've worked so hard to build, as if my 43 years in investment banking, my carefully constructed portfolio, my strategic business partnerships were somehow a family project he'd contributed to. Sandra nodded along, making notes in that little leather portfolio she carried, probably calculating her share of assets she believed would soon be under their control. I remained hidden in the doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs, like a bird trapped in a cage as Jason continued his performance for David Morrison. "She's been making these strange investments lately," he said, waving one of my statements in the air, "putting money into companies I've never heard of, trusting people she barely knows. Yesterday she mentioned something about having business partners and silent investments. It's clear she's confused about her own portfolio." Sandra leaned forward, her voice taking on that syrupy, concerned tone she used whenever she wanted something. "We're so worried about her, Mr. Morrison. She talks about these mysterious business relationships, claims she's been helping fund various ventures for years. It's sad, really, watching someone you love lose touch with reality like this. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass." Jason had been bragging for 15 years about his successful tech company, how he'd built it from nothing, how his innovative software solutions had made him one of the youngest successful entrepreneurs in the city. He wore his success like a badge of honor, spoke at business conferences, gave interviews about self-made success stories. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to investigate, was that his primary investor, the silent partner who'd been quietly funding his entire operation through a carefully structured limited liability company, was sitting in family dinners listening to him pontificate about his business acumen. I'd set it up that way deliberately. After my husband died 12 years ago, I'd wanted to help our children succeed without creating dependency or resentment. I'd established Meridian Investments LLC, a small private equity firm that specialized in early-stage technology companies. Jason's company, Innovate Solutions, had been my first and largest investment. Through a series of strategic funding rounds, bridge loans, and emergency capital injections, I'd kept his company afloat through 3 major financial crises, helped him secure his first major contracts, and provided the steady cash flow that allowed him to attract additional investors. The documentation was all there, filed properly with state and federal agencies, completely legal and transparent to anyone who cared to look. But Jason had never looked. He'd accepted the money as validation of his brilliance, never questioned why Meridian Investments was so willing to support a relatively unknown startup, never wondered why they were so flexible about terms and so patient about returns. He'd built his entire professional identity on the foundation of my financial support without realizing the foundation existed. Standing there in my own doorway, listening to my son declare me mentally incompetent, while planning to steal assets he'd unknowingly been living off for over a decade, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like watching tumblers fall into place in a lock I hadn't known was there. For years, I'd been the accommodating mother, the supportive widow, the woman who quietly handled problems so others could shine. I'd funded Jason's success while sitting through dinners where he explained basic financial concepts to me like I was a child. I'd watched Sandra redecorate my guest bathroom without asking permission because it's not like you use it for guests anyway, Mom. The pattern was so clear now I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. Every family gathering where Jason dominated the conversation with business talk, casually dismissing my occasional contributions with phrases like, well, Mom wouldn't understand the complexities of modern business. Every holiday where Sandra rearranged my furniture because older people sometimes don't notice when things look dated. Every birthday where they gave me gift cards to simple restaurants or basic department stores, the kind of places you shop when you think someone can't handle anything complicated. They'd been conditioning everyone, including me, to see me as declining, dependent, someone who needed guidance and protection. And I'd let them do it because some part of me had bought into the story that widowhood meant stepping back, that my role now was to be grateful for whatever attention and care my children offered, that questioning their decisions or asserting my own preferences would make me a burden. But listening to Jason describe my strange investments and confused statements about business partnerships, I realized he was describing my actual life. The investments were strange to him because he'd never bothered to learn what I actually did for a living before retirement. The business partnership seemed confused because he'd never believed I could have real professional relationships independent of his father. The portfolio decisions looked erratic because he fundamentally didn't understand that a 70-year-old woman might still have valid financial instincts and current market knowledge. David Morrison's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. Jason, I understand your concerns, but your mother has always been remarkably sharp about financial matters. These investments you're questioning, I've reviewed them and they're quite sophisticated. She's actually performing better than most of my clients half her age. Sandra's response was immediate and cutting. Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, you can't see what we see at home. The confusion, the forgetfulness, the way she sometimes seems lost in her own house. These might look like good investments on paper, but what you're seeing is luck, not skill. We need to protect her before that luck runs out. The condescension in her voice, the absolute certainty that any success I might have was accidental, temporary, something that needed to be rescued from my own incompetence, ignited something I hadn't felt since the early days of my banking career, when male colleagues would explain my own analyses back to me with patient smiles. Jason jumped in with more examples of my supposed decline. She's been talking about teaching young entrepreneurs and mentoring business leaders like she's some kind of consultant. It's heartbreaking, really. She was always so proud of Dad's career, and now she's creating these fantasies about having been important in business herself. I almost laughed out loud at that one. For the past 8 years, I'd been a guest lecturer at the business school downtown, teaching a seminar called Alternative Investment Strategies for Family Wealth. My students were MBA candidates and experienced professionals looking to understand how family offices and private equity firms structured deals. The waiting list for my course was 6 months long. But Jason had never asked what I did with my Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He'd assumed I was probably taking some kind of seniors activity class, maybe learning watercolor painting or discussing books with other lonely widows. The irony was suffocating. Here was my son, whose entire career existed because of my business acumen, explaining to my financial advisor that I was delusional about having business expertise. Here was my daughter-in-law, whose lifestyle was funded by dividends from investments I'd carefully selected and nurtured, shaking her head sympathetically about my confusion regarding financial matters. David Morrison was squirming now, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Look, Jason, Sandra, I've been managing your mother's portfolio for 6 years, and I can assure you that she's one of the most informed clients I work with. She reads every quarterly report, questions every fee, challenges every recommendation. If anything, she's more engaged with her finances now than when she first became my client. But Sandra was ready for this objection, too. That's exactly what we're worried about. This obsessive focus on money and investments, it's not normal for someone her age. Healthy seniors are supposed to be focused on relationships, grandchildren, maybe some light hobbies. Instead, she's constantly talking about portfolio performance and market trends. It's like she's become fixated on finances as a way to avoid dealing with the real issues of aging. The psychological manipulation was masterful, I had to admit. They'd taken every sign of my continued professional competence and reframed it as evidence of mental decline. My engagement with investments became unhealthy obsession. My business knowledge became delusional fantasy. My financial success became dangerous luck that needed to be protected from my own poor judgment. Jason pulled out his phone and started reading from what seemed to be prepared notes. Just last week, she told me she was considering a new venture in sustainable technology. When I asked for details, she got vague and defensive. Then yesterday, she mentioned having lunch with someone called young Marcus from the university. She claims he's seeking her advice about funding for some kind of research project. I knew exactly which lunch he was referring to. Dr. Chad Simmons was a brilliant chemical engineer whose revolutionary battery technology was going to transform electric vehicle manufacturing. Our lunch had been a preliminary meeting to discuss whether Meridian Investments would consider a seed funding round for his startup. The technology was so promising that 3 major venture capital firms were already circling, but Marcus preferred working with smaller, more flexible investors who understood the long-term potential of breakthrough innovations. The conversation had been one of the most intellectually stimulating I'd had in months. Marcus treated me as an equal, respecting my questions about scalability and market penetration, valuing my insights about manufacturing partnerships and regulatory challenges. We discussed his 5-year projections, his patent strategy, his plans for building a research team. It had been exactly the kind of cutting-edge investment opportunity that made my work exciting. But through Jason's lens, it became evidence of an elderly woman's fantasies. She's always been susceptible to people who want to take advantage of her generous nature, he explained to David. Dad used to protect her from these kinds of situations, but now she's vulnerable to every smooth talker with a sob story and a get-rich-quick scheme. Sandra nodded emphatically. It's textbook elder abuse, really. These people target older women who are lonely and looking for purpose. They make them feel important and needed, then gradually gain access to their money. We've seen it happen to several people in Mom's age group. The psychological portrait they were painting was so detailed, so internally consistent, and so completely wrong that I began to understand how elder abuse actually worked. It wasn't just about stealing money, it was about stealing identity, rewriting someone's story so thoroughly that even they began to believe the diminished version of themselves. If I hadn't been standing there listening, if I'd only heard Jason's concerns filtered through well-meaning friends or healthcare providers, I might have started questioning my own judgment too. But I was listening, and every word they spoke revealed how little they actually knew about my life. Jason described my concerning habit of staying up late reading financial news as if market analysis was something only confused old ladies did after midnight. Sandra worried about my obsessive attention to my investment accounts, as if monitoring a multi-million-dollar portfolio was an unhealthy hobby rather than basic fiduciary responsibility. They'd been watching me through a lens that expected decline, that interpreted independence as defiance and competence as confusion. Every sign that I remained sharp, engaged, and capable had been twisted into evidence of deterioration. It was a perfect trap. The more effectively I managed my affairs, the more worried they became about my mental state. David Morrison made one more attempt at advocacy. I really think you might be misinterpreting some of your mother's behaviors. The investments she's made through Meridian. Meridian, Jason interrupted, his voice sharp with triumph. That's exactly what we're talking about. She's been claiming she has some special relationship with this investment company, like they seek her advice or something. It's obviously a scam targeting vulnerable seniors. They probably sent her official-looking documents to make her feel important while they drain her accounts. I pressed my hand against the doorframe to steady myself. He thought Meridian Investments was scamming me. My own company, the company that had been funding his salary for 15 years, was in his mind a predatory scheme taking advantage of his poor, confused mother. The complete reversal of reality was breathtaking. Jason, whose business existed because of my strategic investments, was worried that I was being victimized by investors. Sandra, whose comfortable lifestyle was funded by my portfolio's performance, was concerned that I was being manipulated by financial advisors. They'd built their entire understanding of my life on the assumption that I was incapable of independent financial judgment, then used that assumption to interpret everything I did as evidence of incapacity. David Morrison's voice was getting firmer now. Jason, I need to be very clear about something. Meridian Investments isn't scamming your mother. They're a legitimate private equity firm specializing in technology startups. And your mother isn't just a client, she's one of their most sophisticated investors. But Jason was already shaking his head. Mr. Morrison, respectfully, you're not seeing the whole picture. These scammers are getting more sophisticated all the time. They create elaborate fake companies, official-looking documents, even websites that look completely legitimate. Mom probably thinks she's making smart investments, but she's really being systematically defrauded. Sandra was nodding along, adding her own observations. We've done research on elder financial abuse, and this fits the pattern exactly. The scammers always target intelligent, formally successful people because their confidence makes them easier to manipulate. They make their victims feel like partners or advisors, then gradually extract larger and larger amounts of money. The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. Here was my son explaining to my financial advisor that my own investment company was defrauding me, while simultaneously planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could control the assets that were funding his own business. The circular logic was perfect. I was too competent to be competent, too successful to be trusted with success, too independent to be allowed independence. David Morrison tried again. Jason, I think there might be some confusion here. Meridian Investments has been working with your mother for over 15 years. They've generated substantial returns, funded several successful ventures, and maintained complete transparency with all regulatory agencies. This isn't a scam, it's a legitimate business relationship. But Jason was beyond listening to contrary evidence. 15 years, that proves it's a long-term con game. They've been bleeding her slowly, probably taking small amounts at first to build trust, then increasing their take as she became more dependent on their supposed expertise. The fact that you think it looks legitimate just shows how sophisticated these operations have become. I realized then that no amount of evidence would change his mind, because changing his mind would require acknowledging that his fundamental understanding of me was wrong. He'd built his entire relationship with me on the premise that I was a sweet but simple woman who'd been fortunate to marry a successful man and now needed protection from the complexities of modern life. Accepting that I was actually a sharp businesswoman who'd been actively managing investments and funding startups would shatter his entire worldview. It would mean acknowledging that every condescending explanation he'd given me about basic financial concepts had been unnecessary. It would mean recognizing that every decision he'd made for my own good had been presumptuous. It would mean admitting that the business success he was so proud of had been built on my financial foundation. Most importantly, it would mean accepting that the woman he was trying to have declared mentally incompetent was more financially sophisticated than he was. Sandra was pulling out more documentation now, printed emails, bank statements she'd somehow obtained, even photographs of me at various locations around town. We've been documenting everything for months, she explained to David. The strange meetings with people she claims are business associates, the lunch appointments with men half her age who are obviously targeting her money, the way she sometimes seems confused about basic details when we ask about her day. Looking at those photographs, me having coffee with Chad Simmons, me entering the law offices where Meridian's attorneys worked, me at the university where I taught. I saw my life through their eyes for the first time. To someone who believed I was declining mentally, these activities would indeed look suspicious. An elderly woman meeting with young men in restaurants could easily be interpreted as a vulnerable person being manipulated. An older woman entering professional offices might seem confused about where she was or why she was there. A senior citizen on a university campus could appear lost or disoriented. They'd been following me, documenting my actual professional activities, then reinterpreting everything through the lens of expected decline. It was systematic, thorough, and completely wrong. But it was also probably convincing to anyone who shared their assumptions about aging and capacity. Jason was building toward his big finish now. The bottom line is that Mom needs protection, and she's not going to accept it voluntarily because she doesn't understand that she needs help. The Meridian people have probably convinced her that she's still sharp and capable, that she's making smart investments and contributing valuable insights. It's a classic manipulation technique. Tell the victim what they want to hear about themselves while you're robbing them blind. David Morrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable, glancing toward the kitchen as if he sensed my presence. Jason, I really think we should include your mother in this conversation. These are serious allegations you're making, and she has a right to— That's exactly the problem, Sandra interrupted. She's so invested in these fantasies about being a successful businesswoman that she can't see reality anymore. If we confront her directly, she'll just get defensive and retreat further into these delusions. We need to act decisively to protect her assets before it's too late. The word fantasies hit me like a physical blow. My career, my expertise, my actual accomplishments, all dismissed as the delusions of an aging woman who couldn't accept her diminished circumstances. The psychological violence of it was staggering. They weren't just trying to steal my money. They were trying to steal my identity, my history, my sense of who I was and what I'd achieved. But something else was crystallizing in my mind as I listened to their complete misunderstanding of my situation. They thought they were protecting assets from mysterious scammers, but the assets they were trying to protect included the very investments that were funding Jason's company. If they succeeded in gaining control of my portfolio and protecting me from Meridian Investments, they would inadvertently destroy Jason's business. The poetic justice was almost perfect. Jason, in his effort to steal my money because he thought I was too incompetent to manage it properly, was planning to cut off the funding that kept his own company alive. His attempt to save me from supposed financial predators would eliminate the financial predator who was actually keeping him afloat, namely, his own mother. I could have walked into the room right then and explained everything. I could have shown them the incorporation documents for Meridian Investments, the detailed records of every transaction with Innovate Solutions, the legal opinions confirming the legitimacy of every investment decision. I could have proven my competence and ended their guardianship plans with a single afternoon of documentation, but something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity about how far they would go. Maybe it was a desire to understand the full scope of their betrayal before deciding how to respond. Maybe it was just the strategic instinct that had made me successful in business. Gather all the information before making your move. Jason was pulling out more papers now, including what looked like a formal legal document. "We've already consulted with an attorney about the guardianship process," he explained to David. "Dr. Patterson has agreed to conduct a competency evaluation based on our documentation of Mom's declining judgment. Once we have medical backing for our concerns, the court filing should be straightforward." Dr. Patterson. My own internist who'd been treating me for 15 years and had never expressed any concerns about my mental acuity, but I could see how they would manipulate even that relationship. A few casual comments about my confusion and forgetfulness, some leading questions about age-related cognitive changes, a request for him to keep an eye on my decision-making capacity. Before long, they'd have him genuinely concerned about symptoms he'd never noticed before. Sandra was explaining their timeline to David. "We want to move quickly before she makes any more major financial decisions. Yesterday, she mentioned something about considering a significant new investment opportunity. If she's planning to put more money into these scam operations, we could lose everything she and Dad worked so hard to build." The significant new investment opportunity was Dr. Chen's battery technology startup. I'd been planning to invest $2 million in the seed round, contingent on some additional due diligence and patent research. It was exactly the kind of cutting-edge technology investment that could transform an entire industry while generating substantial returns for early investors. But through Jason and Sandra's lens, it was just another scam targeting a vulnerable old woman. They were planning to save me from what could be one of the most profitable investment decisions of my career. The conversation was winding down now, with David Morrison agreeing to monitor the situation closely, and Jason promising to handle everything sensitively. They were shaking hands, making plans for follow-up meetings, discussing how to approach me about simplifying my financial arrangements for my own protection. As they began gathering papers and preparing to leave, I stepped back from the doorway and moved quietly to the back of the house. I needed time to think, to process what I'd learned, to decide how to respond to this comprehensive attempt to steal not just my assets but my autonomy. Over the next several days, I found myself seeing everything differently. Every interaction with Jason and Sandra became a performance where they gathered evidence of my supposed decline while I pretended not to notice their surveillance. They asked leading questions about my daily activities, tested my memory with casual inquiries about recent events, made subtle suggestions about how I might simplify my life for easier management. The psychological manipulation was constant and exhausting. Sandra would mention how overwhelming modern financial systems had become, then watch my reaction to see if I agreed. Jason would bring up news stories about elderly people being victimized by investment scams, then gauge whether I seemed worried about my own financial arrangements. They were trying to plant seeds of self-doubt, to make me question my own judgment so I'd be more receptive to their help. But the strangest part was how their behavior revealed their complete ignorance about the source of their own security. Jason complained about the challenges of running a startup while wearing a watch I'd indirectly paid for through Meridian's strategic partnerships with his suppliers. Sandra redecorated their home with furniture financed by investment returns I'd generated through careful portfolio management. They lived comfortable lives funded by my business acumen while simultaneously planning to have me declared too incompetent to manage business affairs. The irony became even more acute when Jason started giving me advice about money management. "Mom, you know you can trust me to help you with financial decisions, right? I've learned a lot about business and investing over the years. Maybe I could review some of your accounts, help you make sure everything is on track." I nodded politely while thinking about the quarterly reports he'd never seen, the strategic analyses he couldn't understand, the market research that informed every decision he thought I was incapable of making. He was offering to help me manage the investments that were keeping his company afloat, blissfully unaware that his own salary was dependent on my financial judgment. But I was also learning something valuable about my own situation. For years, I'd been the invisible force behind Jason's success, the silent partner who'd enabled his achievements while remaining completely unacknowledged. I told myself this arrangement was generous, that good parents help their children succeed without expecting credit or recognition. Now I understood that this invisibility had become a prison. By hiding my role in Jason's success, I'd allowed him to develop a completely false understanding of his own capabilities and my limitations. I'd enabled him to see me as a simple woman who'd been fortunate in marriage rather than a sophisticated professional who'd made strategic choices about how to support her family. The guardianship plan was just the logical extension of years of willful blindness. Jason genuinely believed I was declining because he'd never bothered to learn who I really was when I wasn't declining. Sandra was convinced I needed protection because she'd never seen evidence of my ability to protect myself. They were responding to a version of me that existed only in their assumptions, but those assumptions had real-world consequences. I spent a week researching guardianship law, consulting with attorneys, and reviewing my options. The legal framework was designed to protect vulnerable people from exploitation, but it could also be used as a tool of exploitation by family members who misrepresented the facts. If Jason and Sandra managed to convince a judge that I was mentally incompetent, I could lose control of my assets, my business decisions, even my living arrangements. The thought of being declared legally incompetent while running a successful investment company was so surreal it was almost funny. But the potential consequences were deadly serious. Everything I'd built over decades of careful planning could be dismantled by people who didn't understand what they were dismantling. That's when I decided to take action. My first call was to James Harrison, the attorney who'd helped me structure Meridian Investments 15 years earlier. James was in his 60s now, with a reputation for brilliant strategic thinking and absolutely no tolerance for nonsense. When I explained the situation, his response was immediate and decisive. "Helen, this is both absurd and dangerous. If they succeed in getting guardianship based on these false premises, the legal complications could take years to untangle. We need to address this proactively, with complete transparency about your actual situation." We spent an afternoon reviewing every aspect of my financial arrangements, from the original Meridian Incorporation documents to the most recent investment decisions. James confirmed what I already knew. There was nothing questionable or concerning about any of my business activities. If anything, my track record showed remarkable consistency and judgment over more than a decade of successful investments. The problem, James explained, is that guardianship proceedings don't always focus on objective evidence. They're designed to be protective, which means judges err on the side of caution. If your son presents a convincing case about your supposed decline, the court might impose restrictions first and sort out the truth later. That's when we developed what James called the full disclosure strategy. Instead of simply defending against Jason's guardianship petition, we would proactively reveal the complete truth about my relationship with his business. We would document every investment, every strategic decision, every financial contribution that had made his success possible. The beauty of this approach, James explained with a slight smile, is that it gives Jason exactly what he says he wants: complete transparency about your financial arrangements. Once he understands that Meridian Investments isn't victimizing you, he should withdraw his concerns about your competency. But I suspected James knew, as I was beginning to understand, that the revelation would be more complicated than simple transparency. Jason wasn't just wrong about my business relationships, he was completely dependent on them. Learning the truth wouldn't just embarrass him, it would shatter his entire self-concept. We decided to handle the revelation strategically, in a controlled environment where all the relevant parties could process the information together. James arranged for a meeting at his law offices, inviting Jason, Sandra, David Morrison, and Dr. Lauren Chandler, the court-appointed evaluator who would have conducted the competency assessment. I spent the days before the meeting in a strange state of anticipation. For 15 years, I'd maintained the fiction that Jason's business success was entirely his own achievement. Now I was about to reveal that his company existed because of my strategic support, that every milestone he'd celebrated had been enabled by my behind-the-scenes financial management. Part of me felt guilty about the deception, even though it had been motivated by love and generosity. I'd wanted to help my son succeed without undermining his confidence or creating dependence. But the deception had backfired catastrophically, enabling him to develop such a distorted view of my capabilities that he was now trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully in my best business suit, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe, paired with the pearls my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like what I was, a professional woman who'd spent decades making complex financial decisions, not the confused elderly person Jason and Sandra had been describing to anyone who would listen. James had prepared meticulously for the meeting, organizing documents in chronological order to tell the complete story of Meridian Investments and its relationship with Innovate Solutions. We had bank records, incorporation papers, investment agreements, tax returns, regulatory filings, everything needed to prove beyond doubt that I was not the victim of financial exploitation, but rather the sophisticated investor who'd been preventing someone else from failing. Jason and Sandra arrived first, both looking tense but determined. Sandra carried her leather portfolio filled with what I now knew was evidence of my supposed decline. Jason wore his best suit and the confident expression he used for important business meetings. They clearly expected this to be a formality, a professional confirmation of concerns they'd already documented thoroughly. David Morrison arrived next, looking uncomfortable with the entire situation. He'd known me as a client for 6 years and had never seen any signs of the confusion Jason and Sandra described, but he was also aware that family members often noticed things that financial advisors missed. Dr. Williams was the last to arrive, a competent-looking woman in her 50s who specialized in geriatric psychology and capacity evaluations. She carried a briefcase full of assessment tools and had clearly prepared to conduct a thorough evaluation of my mental state. James began the meeting by thanking everyone for their time and explaining that we'd gathered to address concerns about my financial decision-making capacity. Mrs. Thompson has asked me to provide complete transparency about her business arrangements so that everyone can make informed decisions about any protective measures that might be appropriate. Jason leaned forward eagerly. Mr. Harrison, we appreciate Mom asking for your help, but we're particularly concerned about her relationship with this Meridian Investments company. We have reason to believe they're taking advantage of her generosity and possibly exploiting her trust in ways she doesn't fully understand. James nodded gravely. Jason, I'm glad you've brought up Meridian Investments, because understanding that relationship is indeed crucial to evaluating your mother's financial situation. Let me share some information that should clarify things considerably. He handed each person a folder containing copies of Meridian's incorporation documents. Meridian Investments LLC was established 15 years ago as a private equity firm specializing in early-stage technology investments. The company has successfully funded 12 different startups, generating an average annual return of 18% for its limited partners. Sandra was already flipping through the papers. Mr. Harrison, this all looks very official, but sophisticated scam operations often create elaborate documentation to fool their victims. The fact that they've created a whole fake company just proves how much they're stealing from Mom. James smiled slightly. Sandra, I understand your skepticism, and it's actually quite appropriate to be cautious about investment opportunities. However, in this case, the documentation is genuine because I personally prepared it. I've been Meridian's corporate attorney since the company's inception. The room was quiet for a moment as people processed this information. Jason was the first to speak. So you're saying this company is legitimate? They're not scamming Mom? Not only are they not scamming her, James continued, but they've been remarkably successful under her guidance. Which brings me to the next point I need to clarify. He handed out another set of documents, the original partnership agreements and investment structure. Jason, Sandra, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about your mother's relationship with Meridian Investments. She's not a client who's being advised by the company. She's the primary owner who makes the investment decisions. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Jason's face as he tried to process what he was hearing, saw Sandra frantically flipping through documents as if they might reveal some different truth upon closer examination. I'm sorry, Jason said finally. Are you saying that Mom owns this investment company? Helen owns 65% of Meridian Investments, James confirmed. She founded the company, she provides the strategic vision, and she makes all major investment decisions. The other partners are passive investors who contribute capital but defer to her expertise on fund management. Dr. Williams, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Mrs. Thompson, perhaps you could explain your role at Meridian in your own words. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the revelation that would either vindicate my competence or expose me to even greater skepticism if they decided my claims were delusional. I established Meridian as a way to continue working in private equity after I retired from commercial banking. I'd spent 43 years in investment banking, specializing in technology sector analysis and early-stage funding. When my husband died, I needed something purposeful to do with my time and my money. Jason was staring at me as if I'd begun speaking a foreign language. Mom, You were never in investment banking. Dad worked in banking. You stayed home with us kids. You managed the household. Jason, I worked for First National Bank for 26 years, then moved to Regional Trust for another 17 years before retiring. Your father worked in retail banking, consumer loans and mortgages. I worked in commercial banking, business loans and investment services. The confusion on his face was genuine and heartbreaking. For his entire adult life, he'd somehow believed that my career had been an extension of his father's, that I'd been a supportive spouse rather than an independent professional. The misunderstanding ran so deep that he couldn't immediately process evidence to the contrary. James was handing out more documents now: my employment history, professional certifications, industry recognition awards. Helen was actually quite distinguished in her field. She was one of the first women to make senior vice president at Regional Trust, and she specialized in technology sector investments throughout the 1980s and 90s. Sandra was studying the documents with growing alarm. But she never talked about having a career. At family dinners, she always just listened when Jason discussed business. We thought she was interested, but didn't really understand the complexities. I listened because I was interested in Jason's work, I explained. But I didn't need to dominate business conversations to prove my competence. I was already handling much more complex transactions than anything Jason's company was involved with. The shift in the room's dynamic was palpable. Dr. Williams was taking notes, but her expression had changed from professional assessment to fascinated observation. David Morrison looked relieved, as if a puzzle he'd been trying to solve had finally revealed its solution. Jason and Sandra looked like they were experiencing some kind of cognitive whiplash. James was continuing with his methodical revelation, clearly enjoying the strategic unveiling of information. Now, Jason, I believe you'll find this next section particularly interesting, since it relates directly to your own business. He handed out a new set of documents, the complete investment history between Meridian and Innovate Solutions. One of Meridian's most successful long-term investments has been a technology company specializing in software solutions for small businesses. The initial investment was made 15 years ago, followed by several rounds of additional funding during critical growth phases. Jason was scanning the papers, his face growing paler as he recognized his own company's financial history laid out in clinical detail. Every emergency loan that had saved his business during rough patches, every strategic investment that had enabled expansion, every bridge loan that had carried him through slow periods, all carefully documented as decisions made by Meridian's primary partner. "This can't be right," Sandra whispered, looking over his shoulder at the documents. "These numbers. This is Jason's company. How would Mom's investment firm know all these details about Innovate Solutions?" James waited a beat before delivering the final revelation. "Because Sandra, Innovate Solutions has been Meridian's largest single investment for the past 15 years. Helen has provided over $4 million in funding to Jason's company, structured as a combination of equity investments, operational loans, and strategic partnerships." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the building's ventilation system. Jason was staring at the documents as if they might spontaneously combust, while Sandra looked back and forth between the papers and my face, like she was watching a tennis match played in slow motion. $4 million? Jason's voice was barely audible. "Mom, you're saying you've invested $4 million in my company?" "Actually," James corrected gently, "the total is closer to $4.7 million when you include the equipment financing and the lease guarantees. Helen has been your primary investor since your second year of operations." I watched my son's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. Everything he'd built, every success he'd celebrated, every milestone he'd achieved had been possible because of financial support from the woman he was trying to have declared mentally incompetent. Dr. Williams set down her pen and addressed me directly. "Mrs. Thompson, help me understand the timeline here. When did you make the decision to invest in your son's company?" "Jason came to me in his second year of business," I explained, my voice steady despite the emotional turbulence I was feeling. He was struggling with cash flow, having trouble securing traditional bank loans because he didn't have sufficient collateral. He needed about $50,000 to avoid bankruptcy. Jason's head snapped up at this. "I remember that conversation, but you said you didn't have that kind of money available. You told me to try the Small Business Administration." "I told you to explore all your options, which was good advice, regardless of what I could offer. But I also immediately began researching your business model, your market potential, your competition. I spent 2 weeks doing due diligence before deciding that Innovate Solutions was a solid investment opportunity. Sandra was shaking her head slowly. But Jason got that money from Meridian Investments, some investment firm that specialized in technology startups. He never said anything about you being involved. Because I asked James to structure the investment so that my identity as the primary partner wouldn't be immediately obvious, I continued. I wanted to help Jason succeed, but I didn't want him to feel like his achievements were just because of family money. I thought it would be better for his confidence if he believed he'd attracted investment based purely on the merits of his business plan. The psychological complexity of what I was describing was clearly overwhelming for everyone in the room. I'd spent 15 years hiding my role in Jason's success to protect his sense of accomplishment, but that deception had enabled him to develop such a distorted view of my capabilities that he'd tried to have me declared mentally incompetent to protect money that was actually mine to begin with. James was still distributing documents, each new revelation adding another layer to the story. Here are the quarterly reports Helen has been receiving about Innovate Solutions' performance. As you can see, she's been actively involved in strategic decision-making, providing guidance on everything from market expansion to personnel decisions. Jason was reading through reports that detailed his own business operations, seeing them for the first time through the lens of an investor's analysis. Comments in the margins showed my recommendations about pricing strategies, concerns about overextension in certain markets, suggestions for partnerships that could strengthen his competitive position. You've been managing my company? His voice was small, confused, like a child who'd just learned that a favorite toy wasn't really his. Not managing, I corrected gently. Advising. You've made all the operational decisions. But when you faced major strategic choices, whether to expand into new markets, whether to hire additional staff, whether to invest in new technology, Meridian has provided analysis and recommendations. Sandra was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly looking for some explanation that would make sense of what she was hearing. But Jason always said he was self-made, that he'd built his business from scratch without help from anyone. He did build the business from scratch, I said firmly. The ideas, the innovation, the daily management, the customer relationships, all of that was Jason's work. I just provided capital when it was needed and strategic advice when it was requested. But even as I said this, I could see that the distinction wasn't meaningful to Jason. In his mind, financial independence and business success were inextricably linked. Learning that his independence had been subsidized felt like learning that his achievements were somehow fraudulent. Dr. Williams was asking more questions now, clearly trying to understand the psychological dynamics at play. Mrs. Thompson, when your son began expressing concerns about your financial judgment, didn't you consider revealing this information sooner? I thought about it, I admitted. But Jason and Sandra had built such a detailed case about my supposed decline that I began to wonder if confronting them directly would just seem like defensiveness. If someone genuinely believes you're becoming confused or delusional, telling them you actually own a successful investment company might sound like exactly the kind of grandiose fantasy they'd expect from someone with declining mental faculties. This observation seemed to resonate with Dr. Williams, who nodded thoughtfully. That's actually a sophisticated understanding of the psychological dynamics involved in capacity concerns. Often, the more vigorously someone defends their competence, the more convinced family members become that they're covering up problems. James was approaching his final revelation now, the one that would transform this from an embarrassing misunderstanding into something with serious practical consequences. Jason, Sandra, there's one more aspect of this situation that I need to explain. When you filed the preliminary paperwork for guardianship proceedings, you listed Helen's major assets and expressed concern about protecting them from financial exploitation. Both Jason and Sandra nodded, clearly relieved to return to what they saw as the core issue. Exactly, Sandra said. We're worried about protecting Mom's portfolio from these investment scams. But here's the issue, James continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. If a guardianship were granted and Helen's investment activities were restricted, it would have immediate and devastating consequences for Innovate Solutions funding. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Jason's face was cycling through confusion, realization, and growing horror as he began to understand what James was telling him. You're saying that if we got guardianship and stopped Mom from making these investments, it would hurt my business? Jason, it would destroy your business, James said bluntly. Meridian Investments provides approximately 60% of Innovate Solutions' operating capital. If Helen were declared incompetent and her investment activities were suspended, Your company would lose its primary funding source within 30 days. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet moments. This was the silence of people processing information that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Jason wasn't just wrong about my mental capacity. His attempt to protect my assets would eliminate the assets that were keeping him financially afloat. Sandra was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Are you saying that by trying to protect Mom's money, we would bankrupt Jason's company? That's exactly what I'm saying, James confirmed. Helen's strange investments and concerning financial decisions that you've been documenting are actually the strategic funding that's been keeping Innovate Solutions operational for 15 years. Jason looked like he was going to be sick. Mom, why didn't you tell me? All this time I thought I was protecting you from being scammed, but I was actually... You were planning to cut off your own funding to protect me from myself, I finished gently. It's understandable, Jason. You were trying to be a good son. You just didn't have all the information you needed to make good decisions. But I could see that simple forgiveness wasn't going to be enough to process what had just been revealed. Jason's entire self-concept had been built around his business success, his independence, his ability to create something viewable through his own efforts. Learning that his achievements had been subsidized by the mother he'd been treating as incompetent was a psychological earthquake that would take time to fully process. Dr. Williams was making more notes, clearly fascinated by the complexity of the family dynamic she was observing. Mrs. Thompson, this is quite remarkable. You've been managing a successful business, teaching at the university level, and providing strategic advice to multiple companies while your family believed you were experiencing cognitive decline. How do you account for such a significant disconnect between your actual capabilities and their perceptions? It was a question I'd been asking myself for days, and I thought I finally understood the answer. I think it happened gradually, over many years. After my husband died, I stepped back from some social activities and became more private about my work. Jason and Sandra interpreted that privacy as confusion or decline. Then, as they became more convinced that I was struggling, they began reinterpreting everything I did through that lens. I paused, trying to find words for something I was still processing myself. But I also think I enabled the misunderstanding by being too accommodating. When Jason would explain basic financial concepts to me, I didn't correct him because I thought it made him feel helpful. When Sandra would make decisions about my house or my schedule, I went along with it because I wanted to avoid conflict. Over time, they became accustomed to treating me as someone who needed guidance, rather than someone who was capable of providing it. Sandra was looking stricken now, clearly realizing how patronizing her behavior had been. Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought I was being helpful, but I was treating you like someone whose opinions didn't matter, I said quietly. Like someone who couldn't be trusted to make good decisions about her own life. The weight of what they'd been doing and planning to do was settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Jason and Sandra hadn't just been wrong about my mental capacity. They'd been systematically undermining my autonomy while depending on my competence for their own financial security. James was wrapping up his presentation now, but the legal implications were still echoing. So to summarize the situation, Rachel Porter is not the victim of financial exploitation. She's a sophisticated investor who's been successfully managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio while providing strategic support to family members who were simultaneously questioning her competence? Dr. Williams closed her notepad and addressed the room. Based on what I've observed today, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. Mrs. Thompson appears to have excellent insight into complex financial relationships, sophisticated understanding of business operations, and clear awareness of the psychological dynamics involved in family decision-making. She turned to Jason and Sandra specifically. In fact, I'd suggest that the family might benefit from counseling to address the communication issues that led to such a significant misunderstanding about Mrs. Thompson's actual capabilities and circumstances. Jason was staring at his hands, clearly struggling to process everything he'd learned. Mom, I don't know what to say. I thought I was protecting you, but I was trying to steal from you. And not just money. I was trying to take away your independence, your right to make your own decisions. The pain in his voice was genuine, and I felt my heart soften despite everything that had happened. Jason, you thought you were doing the right thing based on what you believed was true. The problem wasn't your intentions, it was the assumptions that led to those intentions. But Sandra was asking the question that I knew was really at the heart of the matter. Mom, what happens now? With us, I mean. How do we move forward from this? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The revelation of my actual circumstances had vindicated my competence and ended the immediate threat of guardianship, but it had also exposed 15 years of deception, misunderstanding, and mutual enabling that couldn't be easily resolved. James was packing up his documents, clearly satisfied that the legal issues had been resolved. Helen, I'll withdraw the competency evaluation request and file the appropriate documentation to ensure there are no further guardianship proceedings. From a legal standpoint, your autonomy and financial independence are fully protected. But legal protection wasn't the same as emotional repair. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, I found myself alone with Jason and Sandra in James's conference room, surrounded by the evidence of everything we'd misunderstood about each other. Jason was the first to speak. Mom, I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I genuinely believed you were in trouble, and I thought I was helping. I know, I said simply. But Jason, intention isn't the same as impact. Even though you meant well, what you were planning would have been devastating for me. Being declared mentally incompetent would have destroyed everything I've built over the past 15 years. Sandra was crying now, quiet tears that spoke to genuine remorse. We were so wrong about everything, about who you are, about what you're capable of, about what you need from us. I don't know how to fix this. The truth was, I wasn't sure it could be fixed, at least not in the way Sandra probably meant. The relationship we'd had before, where I was the accommodating mother who deferred to their judgment about my own life, was over. But maybe something better could take its place. I think we need to start by being honest with each other, I said. Really honest, not just polite. Jason, you need to understand that I'm not the helpless widow you've been worrying about. I'm a competent businesswoman who's been supporting your success while you tried to protect me from my own competence. Jason winced at this summary, but he nodded. You're right. I see that now. But Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner? Why did you let me think I was self-made when you were actually funding everything? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself repeatedly over the past few days. Because I thought it would be better for your confidence if you believed you'd succeeded on your own merits. I wanted to help you without undermining your sense of accomplishment. But that backfired, Sandra observed quietly, because Jason built his whole identity around being self-sufficient, and I built my understanding of you around thinking you were dependent. We were both living in a false reality that made us treat you terribly. The insight was painful but accurate. By trying to protect Jason from feeling dependent on family money, I'd enabled him to develop an inflated sense of his own independence while simultaneously undervaluing my contributions to his success. By being too accommodating about their patronizing treatment, I'd reinforced their belief that I needed their guidance and protection. So what do we do now? Jason asked. How do we rebuild our relationship based on the truth instead of these misunderstandings we've all been living with? I had been thinking about this question for days, and I thought I had an answer. We start by establishing some new ground rules for how we interact with each other, rules based on mutual respect rather than assumptions about who needs protection from whom. Over the following weeks, we had several difficult conversations about how our family dynamics needed to change. I explained that I would continue managing my own business affairs and making my own investment decisions, but that I was willing to be more transparent about my activities so Jason and Sandra wouldn't worry unnecessarily. Jason acknowledged that his business success had been built on my strategic support, and we discussed how our partnership might evolve going forward. Sandra had perhaps the most challenging adjustment to make, since her entire relationship with me had been built on the assumption that I needed her help managing basic life tasks. Learning that I was actually more financially sophisticated than she was required a complete reframing of our dynamic. But gradually, something better began to emerge from the wreckage of our old misunderstandings. Jason started consulting me, genuinely about business strategy, instead of explaining basic concepts he thought I didn't understand. Sandra began asking for my advice about financial decisions instead of assuming I needed her guidance. We started having real conversations about complex topics instead of the polite, superficial discussions that had characterized our relationship for years. The most significant change was in how they viewed my independence. Instead of seeing my autonomy as something that needed to be managed and protected, they began to recognize it as something that deserved respect and support. Instead of worrying about my capacity to make decisions, they started appreciating the quality of the decisions I actually made. Jason's business relationship with Meridian Investments also evolved. Now that he understood who his primary investor actually was, He could have direct conversations with me about strategic challenges instead of working through intermediaries. The transparency improved both the business relationship and our family dynamic, since Jason no longer felt like he was being mysterious about his funding sources, and I no longer felt like I had to hide my role in his success. But the most profound change was in how I saw myself. For years, I'd been quietly competent while allowing others to treat me as diminished. I'd been successful in business while permitting family members to explain basic concepts to me. I'd been financially sophisticated while accepting their assumptions that I needed protection from complex decisions. The guardianship crisis had forced me to acknowledge that my accommodating behavior had been enabling their patronizing treatment. By being too polite to correct their misunderstandings, I'd allowed those misunderstandings to escalate until they threatened my fundamental autonomy. Dr. Chen's battery technology startup proved to be exactly the breakthrough opportunity I'd anticipated. My $2 million investment in his seed round generated a 400% return when the company was acquired by a major automotive manufacturer 18 months later. Jason, who had initially worried that I was being scammed by young Marcus from the university, eventually asked to be introduced to Dr. Chen so he could learn about emerging technologies that might complement his own business offerings. The irony wasn't lost on me that the concerning investment Jason had wanted to protect me from became one of the most profitable decisions I'd made in years. But more importantly, it demonstrated that my judgment about people and opportunities remained sharp, that my ability to identify promising investments was still functioning at a high level. 3 years later, our family relationships had stabilized into something much healthier than what we'd had before. Jason still ran Innovate Solutions, but now he consulted with me directly about major strategic decisions, instead of wondering why his mysterious investor always seemed to have such good insights about his market. Sandra had started her own small business and frequently sought my advice about financial planning and investment strategies. Most importantly, they both learned to see me as I actually am. Not the simple woman who'd been fortunate in marriage that they'd imagined, but the sophisticated professional who'd been quietly managing complex business relationships while they focused on their own lives. Not the declining elderly person who needed protection from her own poor judgment, but the sharp investor who'd been protecting their financial security while they planned to protect mine. The experience taught me something valuable about the nature of respect in family relationships. For years, I thought that being a good mother meant being accommodating, that being supportive meant being invisible, that helping my children meant not letting them know they needed help. But accommodation without respect becomes enabling. Support without acknowledgement becomes exploitation. Help without transparency becomes manipulation. Jason learned something equally important about the nature of independence and success. His business achievements were real. The innovative thinking, the customer relationships, the operational excellence were all products of his own efforts. But those achievements had been made possible by financial support and strategic guidance he'd never recognized or appreciated. Real independence wasn't about refusing help. It was about understanding and acknowledging the help you received. Sandra discovered that competence and aging aren't mutually exclusive, that someone could be 70 years old and still possess sophisticated professional skills, that needing reading glasses didn't mean needing someone else to make decisions about your life. But perhaps the most important lesson for all of us was about the danger of assumptions in family relationships. We'd all been operating based on assumptions about each other that were years out of date, if they'd ever been accurate at all. Jason assumed I was a simple woman who'd never really understood business. Sandra assumed I needed her help managing basic life tasks. I assumed they would be threatened by evidence of my continued competence and independence. None of these assumptions were tested or verified. They were just repeated until they felt like facts. And those false facts had nearly destroyed both my autonomy and Jason's business, not because anyone had malicious intentions, but because we'd all stopped paying attention to who we actually were versus who we assumed each other to be. Now, when we have family gatherings, the conversations are richer and more genuine. Jason asks for my perspective on business challenges because he values my experience and insight, not because he's trying to be polite to an elderly relative. Sandra includes me in decision-making about family events because she respects my judgment, not because she thinks I need to feel useful. And I speak up when I have opinions or expertise to offer instead of staying quiet to avoid seeming pushy or overwhelming. I share my successes and challenges, my professional insights and personal concerns, because I've learned that real relationships require real honesty about who we are and what we're capable of. The guardianship crisis that had threatened to destroy my independence had ultimately restored it, not just legally, but emotionally and psychologically. By forcing us all to confront the truth about our actual circumstances and capabilities, it had cleared away years of accumulated misunderstandings and created space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than protective assumptions. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if I'd been more assertive earlier, if I'd corrected Jason's condescending explanations the first time instead of the 100th, if I'd refused Sandra's unwanted help from the beginning instead of accepting it until it became intrusive. But then I remember that Jason and Sandra had also made choices: to assume rather than ask, to interpret rather than investigate, to protect rather than respect. The patterns that had nearly led to my losing legal control of my own life had been decades in the making, built through thousands of small interactions, where we'd all chosen politeness over honesty, assumptions over inquiry, good intentions over good information. Changing those patterns required the shock of almost losing everything that mattered to force us all to pay attention to what we'd been taking for granted. Now, at 73, I'm more professionally active than I've been in years. Meridian Investments is thriving, my university teaching load has expanded, and I'm consulted regularly by other women who are navigating family dynamics around aging and financial independence. I've learned that my experience wasn't unique. Many competent older adults find themselves subjected to well-intentioned but misguided efforts to protect them from their own capabilities. Jason's business continues to grow, but now our partnership is transparent and collaborative. He makes operational decisions based on his market knowledge and customer relationships, while I provide strategic guidance and financial resources based on my experience with technology investments. It's a much more effective arrangement now that we can discuss challenges openly instead of working through intermediaries. Sandra has become one of my closest confidants, someone who genuinely understands both my professional capabilities and my personal values. She often jokes that she learned more about business from me in the year after the guardianship crisis than she'd learned in her entire adult life before that, but the joke reflects a real shift in how she sees both my competence and her own potential. The most satisfying aspect of our transformed relationships is that they're based on reality rather than assumptions, on current circumstances rather than outdated expectations, on mutual respect rather than protective instincts. We know each other now in ways we never had before, and that knowledge has created connections that are both stronger and more honest than what we'd had during all those years of polite misunderstanding. When people ask me about the experience, I tell them that the greatest threat to my independence wasn't aging or declining capacity. It was the assumption that aging necessarily meant declining capacity. The most dangerous enemies of my autonomy weren't strangers trying to exploit my vulnerability, but family members trying to protect me from vulnerabilities I didn't actually have. And the most powerful tool for maintaining independence wasn't hiding my limitations or proving my competence. It was insisting on relationships based on truth rather than assumptions, on current reality rather than protective fantasies, on genuine respect rather than well-intentioned condescension. I'm still teaching, still investing, still making strategic decisions about complex financial arrangements. But now I'm doing it with the support and understanding of family members who see me as I actually am, rather than as they assume I must be becoming. And that makes all the difference, not just for my business success, but for the deeper satisfaction of being known and valued for who I really am, rather than protected from who others fear I might become. At 73, I've learned that the most important investment isn't financial. It's the investment in relationships honest enough to support who we actually are, rather than who we used to be or who we're afraid we might become. And that investment, more than any portfolio or business venture, has generated returns that will sustain me for whatever years remain ahead.